I guess the first thing to do would be to get how the party got started in the first place. So Louis XVI was elected, or not elected, I'm sorry. He became king in 1774. And then eventually the American Revolution breaks out in 1776, and they're faced with a decision whether or not to go in and help them, because they would like to rub their face into, shove it up Britain's ass, more or less, because they had lost the 7 Years' War back in the 1750s. So they were given this opportunity, but they had had a really hard financial time for the last 100 years leading up to the American Revolution. And they were faced with a decision because they did not have a very advanced financial system to either raise taxes or go into debt, or finance it by just getting loans from around Europe. And that's what they did. Instead of raising taxes, which was unpopular, they decided to finance it. And that rendered their situation much worse than it was before. So essentially, I guess what we should always keep in perspective, especially when you're related to modern day times, is liberties are always taken away in financial crises. Or, civil unrest is a direct result of financial crises, and then everything else kind of spins from that. There's a certain chain reaction that tends to happen, just step by step. So, fast forward to 1789, Louis decides to summon the Estates General, which is a body that had not met since the early 1600s. And this was, he could have just defaulted on all the debt, but he thought, let's try to get consensus, let's try to do the right thing, and let's try to get more people involved, because that was the sign of the times. This was the late Enlightenment. They had seen the American example, and everybody in France was really excited about that. Excited about all the ideas it unleashed. And, the Paris salons and things like that, which were like little meeting houses where people would talk about politics and things like that. They were just really interested in liberty and equality and all the things that the Americans were talking about. So they get the Estates General summoned, and very quickly it's apparent that they want more sovereignty for themselves. Because at this point in time, they had the three estates, which was the nobility, the clergy, and then everybody else. So it was very unequal, and it was unjust in a lot of ways. The poor really did pay a significant amount of taxes above than what they made, because the aristocracy found tricky ways to get around getting taxed themselves over the years. And one of the ways they justified this was one of the worst things, which was called the Osteon Regime. One of the worst things they did was they bought and sold offices. So if you wanted to be the governor somewhere, or if you wanted to be the attorney general, you could buy that office. So, what am I doing here?
Kind of like today.
Yeah, absolutely, right, yeah. So, so that obviously takes away some of your freedom with a lot of different ways. So anyway, it was a financial expedient because of the poor finances of Louis XIV and Louis XV, so that instead of doing normal things, they would have to do this. They'd have to resort to selling these offices again and again and again, so you could actually get it taken away from you, and then you have to buy it back again. So it was just terrible. So there was a problem with taxation, and so when they meet, the Estates General, the third estate, begins calling himself the National Assembly. And they eventually declare that they will not disband until France gets a new constitution. These people want things to change, and which is interesting because Louis XVI was a reformer. This is also the time where free markets were just beginning to happen, or the philosophical underpinning of them was all beginning to happen. Adam Smith writes Wealth of Nations in 1776, but the French physiocrats are the ones who really get the ball rolling in the 1750s, and they have influence within the administration of Louis XVI. And they started doing these reforms, but it wasn't enough for the revolutionaries. So I'd like to try to keep, so at this point, they declare themselves, they're the National Assembly, they're not disbanding, they want a new constitution. And this is right before the Bastille Day. So Bastille was July 14th, and that's when they ransacked the prison. Which actually, the Marquis de Sade, if you know who he is, where the term sadistic comes from, he was actually in there about a week before, but he got released for other reasons. But so I'd like to keep this talk mainly to three big points, or at least to make it flow, because there's a lot about this revolution that is very complicated. I would consider it probably one of the more complicated political times in human history, because there's cross currents of everything. So the first thing that really big that happened was was around October 1789, and what they decided to do, because they were having a financial crisis. So the question was, now that we have more culpability to people within office, that they're now potential to be elected and all that kind of stuff, they wanted to steal all the church lands to create a new paper currency to finance everything.
What could go wrong?
Yeah, what could go wrong? So this on its surface does not sound that bad at the time. So it kind of makes sense, but this would really come into trouble a few years down the road, what they did. So obviously when you steal church land, they're not going to take too kindly to it. And also when you create a paper currency, generally speaking, you're going to inflate it more often than not. So that tended to, and also once you rationalize stealing, it can go really anywhere. Now you can do anything. You can now rationalize killing people. So it didn't turn too bad for the first couple years of the revolution. From 1789, there's like two stages of the first stage of the French Revolution, where from 1789 to about 1791 and 1792, there was this attempt to try to create a constitutional monarchy. And there was some agreement to how to make it, and they were trying to do it slowly, but trying to fix things, but not necessarily crumbling everything down to its bare minimum. So they eventually, what happens in 1791 is that the king tries to flee, because he knows he's kind of a prisoner in his own house, because he can't leave. Otherwise, the National Assembly will make him stay. So, but if you fast forward to August 1792, they begin to create a republic. And the king is now basically imprisoned and is basically waiting execution. He has a trial, but it's more like a show trial. So, to kind of bring it back to the paper currency, which was called the assignat, come 1793, they still have a financial crisis. They did not fix anything. Just creating a financial paper currency and stealing a bunch of church land didn't really fix anything. You still need money. And also, by this time, they had started war. Now, again, war tends to take away liberties from everyone, because you're in this time where your entire country's at stake. So they're trying to fight a war. They're trying to get people bread, because that was a big problem. And the price keeps on rising. They're panicking, more or less. And they end up creating the Committee of Public Safety.
Let me guess, they had nothing to do with public safety.
Right. A little bit. All right, so yeah, again, it's always a kernel of truth of the pretense, and then the government goes and does whatever it wants. So what they end up doing, or the reasons why this was created, was because they had a general out in the field fighting Austria and Prussia at the time. And the reason why they were in a war with Prussia is because Marie Antoinette was Austrian, and they knew that the king was basically a prisoner, and they sent this letter and said, "You guys need to let him go, or there's going to be words here." We ain't playing. So they were like, "Oh, fuck me, no, fuck you." So they decided to go to war on that. And and it was very patriotic. At this point, you're creating this new republic. You're basing all these ideas on liberty and equality, and it's in limiting it breathes a certain life into you now all of a sudden. So everybody becomes very patriotic. And that's where the tricolor comes from, with the three colors. Because before that they had a Bourbon monarchy, which is the fleur-de-lis with the white background and all that kind of stuff. So they wanted to go to war to a certain extent. They wanted to prove that they could make themselves and prove themselves with the rest of Europe, who had mostly monarchies. And not only that, they believed in themselves so much that they knew in their heads that once they get to these new countries, they're going to liberate all of Europe. This was their vision initially. Of course, they didn't have the financial backing to do that at this time, because it was just them and this paper currency and the stolen church land, which was subject to the law of diminishing returns, because as you sell more, you have more to sell. And also, part of the idea of stealing church lands was giving it back to the people, but in reality, because it's a financial expediency, they had to sell it to the highest bidder, which tended to be people with already money and land. So, this idea of bringing prosperity back to the people and the peasantry didn't really happen, because it was a financial expediency. So, at the beginning of 1793, one of their generals defects to the Austrians, and he leaves. And that gets them confused, and at this time, even from the very beginning, everything was a conspiracy. So some things were true, and people were conspiring, because the phrase coup d'état is a French phrase for a reason. Everybody really is trying to usurp one person's power versus the other person, and other group to other group, so that the idea of conspiracy is palatable to the people's minds. And some are true, some aren't. But they begin seeing this, and they begin to see traitors all in their midst. So it's not only the enemy that we're fighting ourselves, because, again, the first couple of years of the revolution, there's a lot of people immigrating, a lot of the aristocrats who said, I'm getting the hell out of here, because they realize what all this rhetoric is releasing into the air. So that they get to this point where they create this committee in order to find the traitors and weed them out. Right, more or less. Of course, that's the pretext, more or less. And I think they really sincerely thought that, at least at first. Of course, then it changes once the power was created. It corrupted the human beings within that power. Shouldn't be surprising. So they also had a civil war at the same time that this guy was defected to the Austrians. So in the northwestern part of the country, there was people who, once they killed the king, were like, I don't know what the hell you guys are doing anymore. Because, again, this is a time period where communication is very slow. So the people in Paris could commit atrocities that people in the countryside never even knew about. So they would. So there's a. It's called the Vendée, but it went all the way up to Brittany, close to where Normandy is. And what they wanted was a federal state. They didn't want to have the central power all in Paris, which is what most of the revolutionaries wanted. What they wanted was something more like the United States. We want more autonomy over our own actions. Now that the king's gone, we want more autonomy of what we're doing. We do not want Paris to tell us what to do. And Paris was not interested in that. So they fought a civil war, as well as fighting a war with Austria and Prussia, eventually Spain and Britain. So they're fighting wars everywhere. They have their own countrymen, aristocrats, and the clergy, because all the rhetoric was so anti-rich, anti-previous establishment, that to a certain extent they saw enemies everywhere because they were everywhere, because they made them. They made them enemies. They said, we don't want to be friends with you anymore. So they create the Committee of Public Safety. And right around this time, there's two parties. There's the Girondins and the Montagnards. So just like America, they split into two parties, just like we did with the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. And I think this, to a certain extent, was somewhat of a surprise to them. They had always envisioned of being united and indivisible, partially because of their rhetoric and the philosophy, which I'll get to in a little bit, of what they were all doing. But they They believed that they needed to be all united in order to save the revolution, in order to save the country. And that the fact that there was people, especially in the Vendée, who didn't want that, meant that they were against humanity, is the way they saw it. They weren't just, this wasn't just a political discussion, you're anti-human, this is to a certain extent as they viewed it. So, as the Committee of Public Safety moved on, it tended to consolidate more power and more power and more power. And the first notable group was the Girondins. So, when they killed the king, the Girondins believed that they didn't want to kill the king because they thought there was more use to him alive. But the Montagnards did not trust this. And they were also, the Girondins were also more associated with the guy who defected. And then what happened was that the Girondins were also more free market. So when it came time to, when they noticed that as the price kept on going up, prices were going up for everything, food, bread, water, oil, vinegar, coffee, tea, that the Montagnards did not understand this. They did not understand the economy, or at least they didn't believe it enough to the extent that they wanted to instill price controls. But if you did not believe in price controls, that meant that you were against poor people, more or less.
Wow, that sounds familiar.
Yeah, exactly.
Like the minimum wage.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. You hate poor people, obviously. So that was basically the straw that broke the camel's back. At that point, they couldn't trust him anymore. And there was this really seminal moment in June 1793 where there's also this, basically where Marx gets his idea for the proletariat comes from the French Revolution, at least in my opinion. Because they had this group of, the name of them were sans-culottes, which culottes, if you remember, if you can visualize it, anybody who lived in the late 18th century had these D socks that went up to the, socks that went up to the knees and then the buckles and all that kind of stuff. Well, these were called culottes. So that meant that you were like an aristocrat or high end of society. So if you weren't wearing them, you were a sans-culotte. And these people ended up being like citizen warriors. This wasn't like a true military. It was like people, they just conjured up and said, hey, let's go get pissed off and demand things from the government or demand from the state or from the National Assembly. And in June 1793, they surrounded the National Assembly and said, basically, you need to deliver us, those 22 guys who voted to not kill the king. And if you don't, we're going to kill you all. So there's this really weird moment where, who's in power? What is the power? It's not this, again, I have a ton of sympathies for anarcho-capitalism, all that kind of stuff. I'm really right there. But then I see events like this where, like, if your population is really kind of violent, like the normal man's the society is just a violent society. Because even from 1789, they were cutting people's heads off and putting them on pikes and parading them around and cheering. It's like, how did that happen? Yeah, no, these were the people. These were the people. It's just phenomenal. So anyway, they ended up delivering the 22, and they were in prison, and they had a show trial, which is actually really funny. This is kind of a funny story. They at the show trial, they all got convicted and were guillotined the next day. But there was one guy who basically read the tea leaves, and he killed himself in there. And they didn't want to be taken away. They didn't want to be taken that enjoyment of guillotining him. So even though he was dead, they still guillotined a corpse.
Reality TV.
Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, this Committee of Public Safety was a panel of 9 people, but it expanded to 12. But that was the group of people who basically decided that they needed to be put to trial and be put to death. And a lot of times people didn't even go to trial. So, but after that, basically just took off one of the parties and they had the other party. And then they started splintering up, and then they started killing each other for generally silly things. But in there was, like, for instance, there's Maximilien Robespierre, which was the big guy on the Committee of Public Safety. He was more of a deist. I wouldn't call him Christian, but he was more of a deist, where like, there was a faction also in the same party that was atheist. He didn't like it, so ultimately he ends up killing them. And then there was also another group who they were calling a guy named Danton and Desmoulins, who were his friends. Desmoulins was a kid, he grew up with, Robespierre grew up with Desmoulins. They went to school with him. And then Danton was just a friend, a fellow revolutionary. He ends up killing them as well. And, the reasons why were because they were corrupted, and he wasn't. Robespierre's nickname was the Incorruptible. And the reason why is because he did not let money get into any of the things that he did. And that's what he felt was the paramount of virtue. Of course, the power corrupted him, no doubt. But of course, that didn't matter anything to him. It's kind of like, if I were to relate to nowadays, it's of course not the same thing, because Bernie Sanders is not violent, at least not like this. But it's the same thing. He's incorruptible because he doesn't care about money. But you're consolidating power, and that's not going to corrupt you? Okay. So, and the reason why he believed that they should not have corrupt people within government was because it was this Rousseauian vision, which Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which was their main philosophical heart behind everything they were doing in the revolution. And what he said was that if you're going to have any sovereign power, it needs to be legitimate, and the only legitimate authority is the general will. And how he defined that was basically more or less, to be short, would be to say direct democracy. That the people will never do anything against itself, and therefore it will more often than not, or almost always, be a good. No matter how the vote is, if the majority votes for it, it will be good, and the people who are on the other side of it need to submit to themselves to that general will. So it gets a little complicated, but more or less, that is why they devolved into so many negative things. And I still see a lot of parallels to today in the sense that I think people still believe in that. And I wouldn't say on all issues, but on some issues. And part of his concept too was that maybe modernization isn't a good thing. So that was part of Rousseau's vision, that as we become more modern and get new things, we lose sight of who we really are. And that part of his vision was, the phrase is called the noble savage. So he thought that humanity more or less is corrupted by the institutions that we build. Mankind is inherently good, and that the only way to fix it is to break it down to its bottom, to its bare bones. So you might consider the way he would define liberty would be like a Native American waking up and seeing the whole world before him and the ability to go anywhere he wants. But once you create fences and create private property, that corrupted mankind. So if you're going to fix mankind, you have to destroy that institution. So, and I think that's why some of those revolutionaries called themselves anarchists. I wouldn't call them anarchists, but they called themselves that. So, to bring it back to Robespierre, to see anybody be corrupted by money, or what you might call private interest, was just unacceptable. So that's why everybody called him the Incorruptible. But come to the end, I think people started to see him as what he was, which was a man corrupted by power, and he became a tyrant. Because it was like, once you start killing your own friends, I think people were like, I didn't really think he was that bad of a guy. That guy was a traitor? I don't get that feeling. So, it's this really weird situation where, depending on how you view mankind, and if you view human beings as something to be shaped towards your will, or towards maybe what you call the general will, because that's what Robespierre really thought he was pretending to, that you can rationalize killing people because, well, we need to make this happen. The majority will always be right. So, again, at this particular time, French society was pretty violent. You know, like for instance, to kind of go back, at the very beginning of the revolution, when they stormed the Bastille, the governor ended up getting killed, but they pulled him out in the streets, and then the guy cut his head off with a pocket knife, and then they paraded it around on the pike. In September 1792, when they were creating the revolution, or creating the republic, there was a time where they had something called the September Massacres, where it was about 1,500 people, and the revolutionaries basically had imprisoned other aristocrats and men of the clergy to prison. They were in prison, and they just opened the door, more or less, and pushed them out in the street, and the people killed them. And if you got shot, you were lucky, because most people were hacked to death. The more you learn about it, the more just stunning and startling it becomes. And by the end, they had killed, it was around like 15,000 people who had a trial. They killed about 20 to 40,000 people without a trial in the guillotine. And they actually took a certain enjoyment in it after a while, to the extent that they even would be so happy about how many heads they got off in a certain amount of time, because it was so efficient. So, like, hey, we got 22 heads in 36 minutes. That's great.
Yeah. Wait, was that in front of people? Was it like in the middle of the town?
It was, yeah. That's a good point. Yes, it was. They were public executions for a purpose. So it was to show people, and everybody would usually cheer. So, I went to Paris this last September, which is actually, I didn't mention it earlier, but I did. I went to find some of these assignats, and I found them. So there was a guy in Belgium who had them. So it's really interesting. They were public squares, and it actually got to the point near the end of the revolution where the tempo really got higher, and people complained about the smell of blood, so they had to move it to different parts of town. Yeah, there's also times where horses would not go into town squares because they could smell the blood. It's just phenomenal. And then, and what the really sad thing is that this would lead to basically Napoleon. This unrest, because eventually, Robespierre gets guillotined himself, so it's very fitting. But they go through this 5-year period where it's kind of like there's just this power vacuum, and then Napoleon sucks it up, and he creates the empire. And at that point, you now have a lot more deaths, because now you get humongous wars. But it was all under the same concept that they really started with, was we know we're right, and we're going to spread our ideas to the rest of Europe, and we're going to take down tyrants and replace them with our own tyrant. More or less is what they did. So, if you want to compare the American Revolution and the French Revolution, the American Revolution had about 10,000, or both sides were more closer to 20,000 people. By the end of all the first French Revolutionary Wars from basically 1789 all the way to 1815, the conservative estimate is close to 3.5 to 4 million people.
Dead?
And for what? Yes, dead. And about 1.5 billion French.
There was like half that number.
And there was also, just atrocities with their civil wars. They did the same atrocities in their civil wars that they did to their own people. And it took them a long time to get over it. In 1816, the Bourbons back on the throne. So, they changed everything, but at the same time didn't change anything. So, to try to relate it to modern times, I still think people, they don't think violently like they did, like the French did at the time. But they still use the same philosophical arguments to reach certain conclusions that really what the power of the state is. or what's really the role of the state. And I think there's a lot of parallels to like the environmental movement. You know, it's kind of interesting to see how like whenever there's like a big green movement, there's always Marxists showing up. Why is that? Well, it's partially because they have this bring back to nature concept of if we're going to fix mankind, if we're going to fix this problem, we need to destroy institutions like private property. So, and it's, you know, that's what Rousseau believed. He wanted to bring back mankind to its basic needs, and everything else is just frivolous. So, I guess I could ramble on, but I think it might be better to do Q&A. I don't know how long I've been.
Q&A.